Okay, so the ST1100 is probably one of the most popular wash guns we have. We also do a repair kit for them. So what we're going to do is take you over to the bench and show you how to install that now. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is remove the screws off the actual housing of the gun. So for speed, I'm just going to use a drill. I'm going to actually leave the screws in the housing itself loose, so it makes it just a bit easier to reinstall it. So it's just a case of undoing them till they're all fully loosened off. Okay, so the next thing, just carefully, is I'm just going to put it on the bench and then separate the two casings. And now I can remove the actual assembly out of the gun, put that to one side. So the next thing is put this into a vise with some soft jaws and just get it nice and secure so it's not going to move anywhere. So 17mm spanner. Now it has a shallow nut on this, so I'm going to put my hand on it to stop it slipping off and just crack that off. Okay, and it is under a little bit of compression, so just got to be careful with that. So the spring underneath, so take the nut off and then the spring. There's two different springs in this assembly, so this is the slightly heavier one. It's a slightly heavier spring rate, so just make note of that. Okay, the next thing is the ball bearings. Probably easier just to take it out of the vise for this job and just literally turn it over, flick it into your hand, put that to one side. Okay, so the next thing is the piston assembly itself. Probably the easiest way to get this out is by using a threaded M5 bolt. So simply what I'm going to do is just push it onto the top of the piston and just turn it till it bites and gets hold of the actual piston itself. Fingers. Okay, so there is an orientation with this piston, and the heavier side sits downwards as it's sitting in the vise, so it's got to be slightly thicker on the bottom of the piston, so that sits downwards. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is push the actual piston rod, I'll call it the rod assembly, and just push that all the way through. And what that does, it allows me access to this smaller spring in the bottom. There's a slightly lighter grade spring, lighter spring rate. And it just allows you to pull that out. It's a much finer sort of spring in the bottom. All right, so you pull that out, put that to one side. So the next thing we can do is simply push the rod itself out the bottom because we pushed it through. And that's the rod assembly that activates the trigger from the trigger to the actual valve itself. And put that to one side. Okay, so now we need to get the lower, I don't know what this part is particularly called, probably the lower assembly out. And in this case I'm going to use an M4 bolt because it is actually threaded. So what we can do is simply thread this into the lower assembly itself, and it's just a case of tightening it up. You probably want something like an engineering washer on here, just something to support it against the chassis itself, and it's just simply a case of turning it. It doesn't take a lot of force. You better use a spanner really than a pair of pliers, but it's not going to take much to get it out. So and there you can see it's threaded into the lower itself. It does have a circlip on there, like a little circlip, so just make sure that's in place, and then we can simply screw that off and put it to one side. Okay, so now for the next job is there's a plastic washer in here and a rubber seal. So these can be a little bit tricky to get out, but a little bit of perseverance. We may need to take this out and just gently persuade them out of the actual housing itself. There we go, got them. So it's very tiny, so it's simply a black rubber seal and then a plastic nylon seal as well, washer as well. So the orientation of that is the white one sits right at the bottom and the black one on top of it when it's sitting like that in the actual vise. So make sure it's nice and clean in there. You could probably blow it out with an airline or compressed air, or give it a good swirl through. Probably put a rag in there, and then we're ready for assembly. So for assembly, obviously put it back in the vise, get it nice and secure. So we're going to replace the actual white seal first into the bottom, and just make sure that sits flat right in the bottom of the housing itself, because you don't want to crush it, damage it in any way. It's in there. Okay, so now the next thing is the black seal right in the bottom of there. That into place. Okay, so now the next part is the lower piston assembly. Now it is tapered as well, so it's the smaller diameter sits at the bottom, larger diameter at the top. So we can simply just drop this into place. And what I'm going to do is just seat it with a punch. Just make sure it's actually seated. Shouldn't take a lot of force, but you can sort of tell when it's in place, because the tone of the punch and the hammer just changes slightly when it's clicked into place. Okay, so the next thing is the rod. Now notice you've got a square end on the end of the rod and a sort of a tapered rounded end. Obviously that end sits up against your trigger, so make sure you get the orientation right there. So in this case I'm just going to very carefully use a pair of needle nose pliers and just sort of drop it in to place. Okay, and now we've got the shallower spring, so it's a slightly it's a thin spring rate, so it's a very thinner diameter. Put that into place, and that should basically sit all the way down, which it has. And then we've got the piston assembly itself. So again, the orientation of this is it's got a thicker side on the bottom and a shallower side on the top. So make sure the thicker side is on the bottom, which it is. And I'm just going to gently make sure that's sitting square. The other thing I want to do is just push the actual rod itself all the way down. To the bottom, which it is. Okay, so now we can put the ball on the top. That should sit on the top there. And then we've got the thicker spring, basically sits on top of that. Okay, and then I'm going to use a little bit of blue on here. The original one had a little bit of lock thread, so I'm just going to use a little bit of blue, small amount. Place that on top, and then compress it. And with a spanner, again, just make sure you're sitting square. Until it actually seats. Okay, so that's done up. So that completes the actual repair kit installation. So now it's simply a case of putting it back into the gun itself. So because we've left the screws in the top half of the casing, we could just simply lay this on. And just make sure the trigger's in place properly, and then we can just simply put this carefully on the top, like so. And in this case I'm going to do it up with a screwdriver, because with the plastic female part it's very easy to strip these threads, so it's just a case of doing them up nice and firm. Until the casing is mated properly. Okay, so once they're nice and tight, then it's simply a case of giving it a check, and that completes the installation of the repair kit for the ST1100.